One of my favorite statistics showing the massive impacts of demographics on the development of different countries is a comparison of Greece and Turkey. These two countries are some of the most notorious geopolitical rivals in European politics, and they have a rich and properly dramatic history full of conflict and tensions that still prevail today. Now, in 1928, almost a century ago, the population of Greece was 6.2 million people, while the population of Turkey was 13.6 million. So Turkey clearly had an advantage, nearly double the population size, but the countries were more or less in the same ballpark. Today, after a century of very different demographic development in the two countries, the situation could not be more different. While Greece is a country of 10.5 million people, with one of the oldest, fastest aging and declining populations in the world, Turkey has become somewhat of a demographic behemoth, with a current population of 85 million people and growing, and an average age over 10 years younger than that of Greece. The two countries are now in a completely different positions on the world stage, and any hypothetical military conflict, not saying that it is likely to happen, would mean a conflict between two countries with hugely different capabilities in terms of human capital. The disparity would be much larger than even the one between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey is now the 17th most populous country on the planet. And yet, clouds are gathering on the horizon. Since 2014, the Turkish fertility rate has steadily declined, reaching 1.5 children per woman in 2023. More than that, a closer analysis of Turkish demographics on a regional and ethnic level shows that the situation is likely to get significantly worse in the future. Turkish demographics increasingly look like a ticking time bomb. Turkey is also likely very representative of how the demographic development will look in many Muslim countries, undergoing a certain level of socio-economic development. The thesis, that so far seems to be confirmed by the development around the world, is that when societies with traditionally relatively lower position of women and dense family systems are confronted by modernity, measured by factors like female literacy, urbanization, or industrialization, the fertility is usually very low. Lower than in developed countries with a more ingrained tradition of relative equality of the sexes, seen for example in Northwestern Europe or the Anglosphere. If we can judge by the example of Turkey, this thesis is correct. There is an extraordinary level of demographic diversity within Turkey. In 2023, the fertility rates on the level of provinces ranged from 3.27 children per woman in Şanlıurfa province to 1.13 in Bartın province. The median age in Şanlıurfa province is 21 years, while in many provinces in the north and west of the country it is over 40. In terms of crude birth rate, so the number of births per 1,000 people, it ranges from over 20 in the most fertile provinces to levels around 7 in the least fertile ones. Now, let's stop for a moment to appreciate this difference, since that is something rather extraordinary. Within one country, there are provinces with demographic profiles as different as those of Iraq and Italy. I have done a brief research on other countries with diverse regional fertility rates, and I have not found any other with such a massive disparity. There might be some. I have not checked every country on the planet. If you know about any other, let me know in the comments. But it is really something. Sociologically, populations with such vastly different reproductive behaviors can hardly be considered a homogeneous social body. It is fair to acknowledge that the Şanlıurfa province, with over 3 children per woman, is an outlier in this regard. No other province has fertility above 3 children per woman. There is, however, a belt of 10 provinces that are all above replacement level. They are all concentrated in the southeast of Turkey, where the Kurdish population is concentrated as well, close to the Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranian borders. Now, there are no precise statistics on the fertility rate of different ethnic groups within Turkey, but it is commonly accepted that these high fertility regions in the southeast of the country are demographically pulled by the Kurdish majorities in these regions. Since these regions are the poorest and most rural in Turkey, the ethnic Turks, as well as other minorities such as Arabs living in these parts of the country, likely have higher fertility as well. The relationship of the Turkish state towards its Kurdish population can be politely described as very complicated. According to the estimates, there are between 15 and 20 million Kurds in Turkey, constituting approximately 18% of the population. So, a very significant minority. The Turkish state has been worried about Kurdish irredentism basically since its creation a century ago. since Kurds see themselves as proud and distinct people and aspire for their own nation-state, Kurdistan. They are also a typical mountainous tribal warrior culture, and there has been a long series of armed uprisings of Kurds against the Turkish state, which for a long time denied the existence of the Kurdish nation as such and called Kurds the Mountain Turks, which seems like a top-notch trolling. It made me think that during the First Czechoslovak Republic, when the elites tried to push the idea of one Czechoslovak nation, they should have just called Slovaks the Mountain Czechs. There would probably be an armed uprising as well. Without getting into too much detail, there has been a sometimes hot, sometimes cold conflict for the last 100 years brewing between Kurds and the Turkish state, and the casualties on both sides amount to 120,000 people. So, it is a rather grim affair. It is thus quite a logical conclusion that from the point of view of political demography, the rather spectacular disbalance in the demographic profile of the two populations might be seriously problematic for Turkey in the decades to come. The fertility in the Kurdish regions is declining rather rapidly as well. In 2016, all regions that are now between 2 and 3 children per woman were between 3 and 4 children per woman. So, the trend is rather clear, and the fertility in these areas will most likely continue to decline. In the past 20 years, mean years of schooling have often increased by 50% in the underdeveloped southeastern regions of the country, which usually precedes a declining fertility rate. They have, however, a strong ally in the form of demographic momentum on their side. Since the median age in these areas is often close to 20 years, there is just a much larger proportion of the population in the reproductive age, and the population growth will thus continue to be quite significant in the years and decades to come. To put this in some numerical perspective, Central East and Southeast Anatolia accounted for 40% of the natural population growth in Turkey, while comprising only 15% of the population in 2022. In anthropological terms, the region is distinct in the comparatively very high level of first cousin marriages, close to 20%, accompanied by comparatively high female illiteracy and infant mortality, although both of these markers are declining. Turkey is a typical example of a country within which populations in different stages of the demographic transition coexist. While the southeastern, predominantly Kurdish population seems to be in the final stage of the high growth phase of the demographic transition, the western Turkish heartland has already entered the post-growth phase. Part of Turkey is demographically and anthropologically, as showcased by the high level of first cousin marriages, firmly part of the Middle East. The western part of Turkey seems to be on its way to Europe, demographically speaking. The growing Kurdish numbers have echoed in the Turkish electoral results as well. Between 1994 and 2015, the electoral gains of the Kurdish political parties have grown from 4 to 13%. Due to the large-scale internal Turkish migration of the Kurds to big cities, the largest Kurdish city in Turkey is now Istanbul, where around 2 million Kurds reside. It was one of the factors that led to the electoral loss for Erdogan's Justice and Development Party in the Istanbul municipal elections in 2019 and 2024. Since President Erdogan needed to showcase anti-Kurdish sentiments to court the Turkish nationalist voters, the Kurdish residents turned away from his party. Similar processes that are now taking place between the Turks and Kurds have happened between the different social classes of the Turkish population in the past decades. Many of the country's western, most developed and wealthiest regions have had sub-replacement fertility for decades. Between 1980 and 2000, the western part of the country started to slide to sub-replacement levels, especially the large urban areas. The more rural, poorer and conservative central part of the country has nevertheless maintained solid fertility rates until relatively recently. As recently as 2015, there has been a solid portion of ethnically Turkish territories in the south-central and northeastern part of the country, with above replacement fertility rates. Today, there is not a single one. Within Turkey, the terms white Turks and black Turks are often used to describe different parts of Turkish society. White Turks are the predominantly urban, more educated, Western Turkey-based classes that embrace the legacy of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his grand project of westernization of Turkey. Now, Turkey has undergone some of the most ambitious and sweeping government-led top-down modernization reforms in history. After the humiliating decline of the Ottoman Empire in comparison with the Western powers throughout the 19th century and the dissolution of the empire after the First World War, The new leader of the nation embarked on a project whose aim was to imitate the Western socio-economic model in order to achieve the Western level of economic and industrial power. It could be perhaps compared to the reforms that Japan underwent in the 19th century, even though the results were significantly more impressive in the Japanese case. Atatürk's Turkey was defined by sweeping political, social, cultural and religious reforms designed to separate the republican state from its Ottoman predecessor and embrace a Western lifestyle, including the establishment of secularism, state support of the sciences, gender equality, economic statism, and more. The White Turks are part of the Turkish society that adopted these values and embraced them as their own. Nevertheless, a significant part of Turkish society has never fully identified with these reforms and has remained attached to the older values based on the Islamic faith. Predominantly rural, less educated and poorer, their values were, for a long time, marginalized by the Turkish political classes. But the unstoppable forces of demographics have prevailed. For a long time, the secular, urban, white Turks had significantly lower fertility rates than the black Turks, and in the 2002 elections, the contemporary president of Turkey, Erdogan, who explicitly claimed to represent the conservative Black Turks, won the elections and became the prime minister. His Justice and Development Party crushed the Kemalist Republican People's Party. This event somewhat reminded me of the 1977 elections in Israel, when the right-wing Likud party won for the first time and ended the hegemony of the secular Zionist leftist parties in Israel. There, the electoral success was also underpinned by demographic changes and the growing numbers of the more conservative and pious Mizrahi Jews from the Middle Eastern diaspora, which supported Likud more, while the Ashkenazi European Jewish population traditionally supported the secular left. The conflict between these groups in Turkey remains highly relevant to this day. The dynamic internal migration of more conservative rural populations into Turkish metropolitan areas has significantly altered the demographic profile of cities like Istanbul or Ankara, where neighborhoods have very different vibes. You can find very European-feeling neighborhoods in Istanbul and very Middle Eastern neighborhoods as well. I have spoken to several Turks in my life, usually some kind of exchange university students in Europe. They looked and behaved completely European-like. If they told me they were from Spain or southern Italy, I would have believed them. They drank alcohol, and every one of them disliked President Erdogan. One guy from the Istanbul metropolitan area I recently spoke to in the Czech Republic told me that the urban Turkish youth is more liberal than the Czech youth. However, the migration streams from Turkey to Western European countries like Germany often originate in the poorer and more rural Turkish regions, which means that the immigrant communities in such countries often hold on more to the values common among the so-called Black Turks. While arranged and cousin marriages are non-existent among the westernized urban classes, they are still far from uncommon among the Black Turks. Researchers estimate that they recently comprised around 10% of marriages among these populations, so significantly less than among the Kurdish population in Turkey and among most of the Arab Muslim societies, but much more than among any native Europeans, where the influence of Christianity effectively wiped out this practice. But in the past decade or so, the demographic advantage of the central and eastern ethnically Turkish regions has been exhausted. Turkey is entering a completely new phase of its demographic history. In the past 100 years, all social markers pointing to effective modernity and low fertility have continuously trended upwards. Urbanization rate increased from 25% in 1950 to 75% today. The literacy rate increased from barely 20% in the 1930s to over 97% today. The percentage of the labor force employed in agriculture decreased from 80% in the 1930s to 17% today. The massive increase in urbanization rate in the past decades has effectively made Turkey a country of megacities. In the four largest metropolitan areas in Turkey, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, and Bursa, 30 million people live, so a third of the country's population. The issue is that Turkish cities are prime example of urban demographic black holes. Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir all have fertility rates of around 1.2 children per woman. Due to the previous demographic development, Turkey still is a relatively young country, with a median age of 34, but it is on the verge of a rather spectacular aging and consequent demographic decline. In 2023, 11 out of 81 Turkish provinces recorded a natural population decline. Several others were very close to it, and will almost certainly reach that point in the near future. These provinces are concentrated on the northern Black Sea coast, or in the northwest of the country, and usually have a median age over 40. There is something about the Black Sea that makes it a hotspot of depopulation. All the territories bordering the Black Sea are demographically damaged. Turkey still has time before the consequences of the current demographic slump fully kick in. Apart from still very demographically dynamic Kurdish regions, there is a bulk of ethnically Turkish provinces that still are comparatively young, with their median age usually being over 30. However, the fertility rate is now sub-replacement in all of them and is declining rapidly, while the median age is quickly increasing. The Mediterranean and Central Anatolia regions, those containing the bulk of the previously higher fertility, younger ethnically Turkish provinces, went from replacement level fertility a decade ago to around 1.5 children per woman today. The countries west and north are at levels of around 1.3 children per woman. Moreover, it does not seem to be a glitch, but rather a substantial trend. The economic situation of Turkey has been somewhat chaotic for many years now, with persistently high inflation, which definitely contributed to the negative development. But even with some level of economic stabilization in the future, I do not see a high probability of a significant fertility increase, since the decline is primarily caused by the well-known and deeply rooted social changes, primarily by urbanization and growing female literacy and education rates. I will be highly anticipating statistics on the development of the Turkish fertility in 2024 to see if the trend continues. To put it in some context, if the pace of decline that occurred in the past 5 years would continue for another 5 years, Turkey would have a fertility rate of 1 child per woman. The demographic hollowing of Turkey has begun. As always, there will be consequences for the Turkish state. The proportion of the Kurdish population will increase. Turkey also hosts one of the highest refugee populations on the planet, over 4 million people, predominantly from Syria, but also from other countries in the region. Their presence is already causing a serious social backlash in Turkey, and together with the Kurdish population growth and aging of the Turkish ethnic majority, demographic anxieties, not much different from those experienced in the West, will likely strengthen. The proportion of the Turkish population older than 65 years has increased from 7% in 2007 to 10% in 2023, and is projected to further increase to 13% in 2030. Since Turkish fertility has been declining more rapidly than projections anticipated, it might be closer to 15% in reality, similar to Taiwan, South Korea or the United States today. Amount of men in the military age will be declining, influencing the geopolitical capabilities of Turkey. 10 to 20 years from now, Turkey will be dealing with very different demographic issues than we usually associate with majority Muslim countries. But we should get used to it. Modernity spares no one. That is probably the most interesting aspect of this issue for me. In a couple of decades, we will have many examples of aging societies across all the major civilizations, geographies, family types, and levels of economic development. It will be fascinating to compare how different societies will react to these changes. If you enjoy my videos and would like for me to continue making them, please like and subscribe, or consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. It means the world to me. Thank you very much.